Hi, and welcome to Why You Should and Should Not Use Markdown. I'm Peter Conrad. I'm a senior content designer at Atlassian, where we use Markdown for some of our developer documentation. I was, of course, planning to present this live, but since the conference is entirely online this year, this is a recording. I will take questions in the chat. I'll do a Zoom open house this evening at 6 p.m. Pacific time for anyone interested in talking more about these topics. I'll paste a link in the chat, and the meeting ID and password are on what would have been the Q&A slide. Let's start with a question. What is the most efficient animal in terms of locomotion? I wish I could pause and take answers in the chat, but this is a recording. If you don't know, you might guess it's a bird, but some of you already know. Apparently, the condor is the most energy-efficient animal by weight in terms of locomotion. This comes from an article in Scientific American in 1973. According to the same article, humans are kind of in the mid-range in terms of locomotive efficiency, until you put them on a bicycle, at which point we become the most efficient by a noticeable amount. There's some dispute about this, especially as the jellyfish seems to be very efficient, albeit slow. But Steve Jobs was a fan of this factoid and quoted it several times. And if it's good enough for him, it's going to have to be good enough for us today. Bicycles can do more than we sometimes think. They can go up mountains, set speed records, carry heavy things or multiple people. But we all know bikes aren't good for everything. There are some locomotion jobs where a bicycle is not the right choice. Now, what do you suppose is the most efficient animal in terms of creating HTML? Of course, the answer is a human with Markdown. Today, I will show you a little bit about what the HTML bicycle is good for, what it's not good for, and some interesting places to go for a ride. At the end, I'll show you some cool tricks you can do with Markdown and the right tools. John Gruber, a writer and UI designer, invented Markdown in 2004, a lightweight markup language plus a Perl script for converting Markdown to valid, well-formed XHTML or HTML. Its main purpose was to make it easier to create web pages without all those HTML tags getting in the way of the writing process. Markdown was not intended to replace HTML, but to augment it. It is meant as a writing tool, whereas HTML is a publishing format. Accordingly, its syntax is small. It addresses the subset of HTML tags that specify things which could be conveyed in plain text. In fact, one inspiration for Markdown syntax was the kind of formatting that people use in plain text email. The idea was to make it very easy to read, write, and edit prose with some formatting, and that the result should be usable as is. By the way, Daring Fireball is John Gruber's website, and you can find a lot of information about Markdown there, including a cheat sheet. You've probably already seen things that look like Markdown. Here's some basic syntax. You can see how Markdown elements convert directly to HTML. This screenshot is from a split-screen editor called Ghostwriter, which gives you a live preview on the right as you edit your Markdown on the left. The syntax is very simple. You do headings with hashtags or octothorpes. There are a couple of different ways to do bold and italic. You can do an unordered list with hyphens, asterisks, or plus signs. Image syntax looks like this. There's an exclamation point, then alt text in square brackets, then the URL to the image. A link is similar in syntax to an image. No exclamation point, just the text you want to link in square brackets, then the URL in parentheses. There's a second way to do links called reference links. All you need to put in your paragraph is the text you want to link and an ID, both in square brackets. Then elsewhere in your document, you have a list of the URLs the IDs correspond to. You can do images this way too. You can do block quotes by putting an angle bracket or greater than sign at the beginning of the line, just like you might see in quoted text in an old ASCII-only email. Because Markdown considers lines that aren't separated by a blank line part of the same paragraph, you can just put one at the beginning of a group of lines, or you can use one at the beginning of every line to make it easier to read. Numbered lists are as easy as unordered lists. You just use a number and a period at the start of each line. The numbers don't matter. When it's rendered into HTML, the numbers are done for you. In a way, it's the limitations of Markdown that make it revolutionary. Other markup languages can do everything Markdown can do, and more. What makes Markdown interesting is that it gets excessive features out of the way of the mechanics of writing. The focus is on the writer first, and capability is added only where it helps with what the writer is trying to do. If you need more than what Markdown provides, you can add some HTML, but the main goal is a simple, uncluttered writing environment. Of course, these limitations didn't sit well with everyone. Over the first few years after Markdown was invented, while most programming languages were developing parsers and libraries for Markdown, many sites were developing their own variations with additional features. Reddit, GitHub, Stack Exchange, WordPress, and others created derivative versions of Markdown that provided capabilities not included in the original specification. Here's a glimpse into how a few of the flavors differ. I'm not showing all the flavors or all the differences, but here are just a few that are interesting. CommonMark was created in 2012 as an attempt to create a standard for Markdown. Gruber did not support the idea of a standard as he felt that a single syntax would be unlikely to satisfy different users with different needs. CommonMark does add a few features. One of the most interesting is the fenced code block. In standard Markdown, you indicate a code block by indenting each line by at least 4 spaces. In a fenced code block, you put a row of 3 backticks at the top and bottom of the code. It's really nice because you can copy and paste code into your document without worrying about the indentation. GitHub-flavored Markdown is a superset of CommonMark used on GitHub and a lot of other places. GFM adds tables, strike-through, task lists, and autolinks, among other things. An autolink just means that when you put a URL in, it automatically turns it into a live link for you. And here's how all that stuff renders. Markdown Extra is another dialect supported in content management systems like Drupal and MediaWiki. This variant lets you add ID and class attributes to elements such as headers. It also gives you some cool syntax for things like footnotes, abbreviations, and definition lists. With a footnote, you can use any text or numerical identifier you want. Abbreviations, of course, give you the ability to provide a definition in place, and then when you mouse over the HTML, you see the definition. Definition lists make it easy to format glossaries. With Markdown Extra, fenced code blocks are even cooler than they started out in CommonMark. You can indicate the type of code next to the top row of backticks, and then you get things like custom highlighting for different languages. Even basic, apparently. Multi-Markdown includes tables, footnotes, and other features. It also includes a tool to convert Markdown into formats such as HTML, PDF, and Open Document. And it adds syntax for smart typography, text highlighting, citations, superscripts and subscripts, and other cool things. With all these different flavors of Markdown, it would be useful to see how a specific snippet of Markdown will work with whatever parsers or tools you are using. BabelMark is an online tool for comparing the syntax and output of various implementations. You can enter a Markdown fragment and see how it is rendered by different flavors. It gives you the HTML source and a preview, and it compares the output of pretty much all the flavors you are likely to run into. But that doesn't answer the question. Should you or shouldn't you? I'm going to tell you why not to use Markdown first, and then I will end on a high note about why maybe you actually should. And then after that, I'll show you a few cool things you can do with Markdown tools. Why you should not use Markdown. With its clunky syntax and lack of features, you can already see some reasons to avoid Markdown. Let me give you some more. Markdown has huge momentum because it's easy, and then, as you end up with more and more content, you start thinking, we should have used something else. The syntax is limited and fragile. Tables and links are horrible to read and easy to break. Some basic authoring stuff is really hard. Just because it's easy to start typing doesn't mean it's going to be easy in the long run. Simple things like tables can get really confusing and ugly. On the right, you see the table from a few slides back. On the left, you see the Markdown source, at least one way of doing it. Imagine if this table were a little more complicated, if each cell had a couple sentences in it. Before long, it would be incomprehensible to human eyes. This one is pretty simple, and it already hurts to look at it. Other things that should be simple sometimes don't work as expected. I created a line of code and added it to an unordered list and an ordered list. You indent 4 spaces for the code, then 2 spaces to add it to an unordered list, or 3 for an ordered list. You can see that it worked. But why do I get syntax highlighting in one and not the other? I looked in BabelMark to see how different parsers would handle it. Some gave me what I expected, others didn't. So sometimes the simplest things don't seem to work the way they're supposed to. Let's talk about document structure. It's nice to be able to provide clues about what different parts of a document mean. This is the title, this is the abstract, this is a warning, and so on. In other words, the document structure, as opposed to just presentational information. Markdown doesn't have this capability in its DNA. It was designed to make simple HTML easy to create. It was not designed to express much about the document structure. There's no Markdown element that means section or abstract. There are different heading levels and a few types of lists, but there's no consistent expression of semantic structure. Instead, Markdown mostly does presentational formatting. That describes how different parts of a document are supposed to look. There's a little bit of a structural clue with headings and lists, but it's incomplete. And in fact, you couldn't do what I'm showing in this example, because you can't tell Markdown to put an icon next to an indented block of text. There's no design language with Markdown, so it's not really good at structural expression or presentational expression. This has ramifications for usability because you can't indicate a class, a warning, or some other structural element in any meaningful way. It also makes portability an issue. You can't map element types to each other, which makes it more difficult to convert to other formats. You might write content in one flavor of Markdown, and then you might discover that the publishing process uses a different flavor. Or you might be using the same flavor throughout the writing and publishing workflow, but discover that different parsers interpret the Markdown differently. A blank line in the wrong place, too many or too few spaces, or getting the number of indents just right can be painful and inconsistent. So it's not even portable between tools in the same content workflow. Because it's not semantic, it's not as easy for someone who doesn't know the content to get familiar with its structure, which causes maintenance problems. Accessibility often relies on structural semantic cues, which Markdown doesn't really provide. And finally, there are SEO ramifications as well. In HTML, search engines rank keywords by their location in the hierarchy, but Markdown doesn't really record a lot of structural information. Markdown has no standard and is not extensible, 2 complaints which might seem to cancel each other out, but they're worth mentioning. No standard means you always end up having to figure out what flavor you're using and what it will and won't do. And if different tools in your toolchain use different flavors, or parse the same flavor differently, you might not get the results you want. At the same time, there's no extensibility framework built in, so you can't add features when you need to. There's also no way to manage longer documents in Markdown either. You can't easily incorporate pieces together, reuse content, or even create a table of contents. Once you're managing something larger than a single page of formatted text, Markdown kind of throws up its hands. If all that weren't enough, the fact that Markdown is a superset of HTML makes it a security risk, because it's susceptible to cross-site scripting, or XSS attacks. Unlike normal HTML, Markdown is unescaped, stripping away much of the ability to protect against these attacks. If you're tempted to use Markdown, you should consider using some strong alternatives that provide extensibility, structural semantics, and other capabilities that you might like. AsciiDoc, originally designed as a plain text alternative to DocBook, was created with structured writing in mind, and is extensible by design. It can generate output in numerous formats, including DocBook, obviously, and is part of Atlas, which O'Reilly uses in producing their manuals. Restructured text was initially released in 2002, making it actually older than Markdown. Extensibility is a core principle in its design, but it is already more fully featured including footnotes, tables, citations, and tables of contents right out of the box. With all this, it has a comprehensive specification and a single canonical implementation still under development via the DocUtils project. Now we're going to cross out the not, and I'll tell you why you actually should use Markdown. Above all, Markdown does what it was designed to do. It provides a simple, fast environment that lets you get straight to the writing. You can quickly format text in any editor on any platform without even letting your mouse get in the way. It's easy to learn, and the results are easy to read. I personally find it much easier to remember Markdown syntax than either ASCII doc or restructured text. Don't worry about syntax inconsistencies between flavors. Just pick what you want, get it working. There are plenty of tools that add features and take care of syntax differences. Think of Markdown as a starting point. Different tools give you different adapters to get you where you need to go. Markdown is easy, and it's everywhere. Just pick it up and go. If you end up using CommonMark and Hugo, or GFM on GitHub, or the Python extensions on some other tool, you'll get used to what you can and can't do. And at the core, you're using Markdown, so when you need to switch to another flavor, you already know 90% of what you need to. Markdown's limited features keep formatting consistent between documents and between authors because you can't make choices about font, text size, kerning, margins, or other visual design. There are a few heading levels, bullets, numbers, basic formatting, and that's kind of it. Actually, you can manage bigger documents. You can use YAML, which stands for YAML Ain't Markup Language, to define and give values to variables. A block of YAML goes at the front of a Markdown file. Markdown processing and management frameworks can interpret these variables and use them to do things. The variables can be metadata for the document or other variables you want to use for other purposes. So you can use YAML to create tables of contents, arrange Markdown files into structures, and manage documents that are made up of different parts. Here's an actual example of YAML from a real piece of documentation. It gives a title, shows when the document was last updated, and provides some other information that helps determine where the document lives in the site and in the left-hand navigation tree. YAML is a complicated enough topic to be its own presentation, so that's about all I'm going to say about it here. There are also other formats like TOML and JSON that you can use for the same purpose. You can also manage large documentation sets with frameworks that are designed to manage a bunch of Markdown pages to turn them into a website or a book. I've listed 3 types here: documentation site generators, static site generators, and wikis. But there are many different kinds of frameworks, and the number is growing. And actually, Markdown is extensible, sort of. By writing or rewriting your own parser, you can create a superset of Markdown like the flavors we talked about earlier. Many organizations have done just that. Reddit has a few specific extensions that are tailor-made for their website. The Python Markdown extensions include support for a bunch of new syntax, and Python Markdown offers a flexible extension mechanism which makes it possible to change or extend the behavior of the parser without having to edit the actual source files. Hugo has its own extensions. Hugo uses the Goldmark parser, which is extensible and CommonMark compliant. With Hugo, you can give IDs to headings so you can do internal linking. There's a syntax for emojis, and the most powerful feature in Hugo, shortcodes, let you do all kinds of things like advanced image syntax, inserting content from sites like Twitter and YouTube, and you can create custom shortcodes. There are also Hugo themes that include shortcodes for admonitions and other things. Pandoc is a conversion tool that supports several Markdown dialects and has a few tricks of its own. Like Hugo, it lets you give IDs to headings for internal linking, but it also automatically gives headings IDs even if you don't. It does smart typography. It uses Mermaid to do diagrams and text to do math. It has line blocks for things like poems where you want to preserve line breaks without introducing extra space between lines. It lets you restart list numbering, do tables with multiple lines and cells, and pass info into the doc with metadata blocks. It even has its own syntax for divs and spans to let you do things like multiple columns. Spoiler alert, we'll talk more about Pandoc in a few minutes. Many tools are Markdown capable, including favorites like Doxygen, Git, Trello, and WordPress. It's everywhere. A lot of engineers already know about Markdown because they use it to format code documentation in GitHub, for example. By the way, since it's just text, it's easy to manage with any source control tool. That gives you version history and makes it possible to merge and diff Markdown as easily as any other text file. Markdown is widely used, and because it's just ASCII text after all, it's future-proof. When our descendants are trying to figure out how to open a PDF, Markdown will be sitting there like a Rosetta Stone out in the open. Companies you trust use Markdown for docs. Adobe uses Markdown for its technical documentation articles. Microsoft has its own version of Markdown for docs.microsoft.com. Apple uses Markdown for its developer news. And at Atlassian, we use Markdown and YAML extensively for our developer documentation. If I've already convinced you to use Markdown, then you know you need some tools. If I haven't convinced you yet, then some of the cool things these tools can do might change your mind. There are plenty of online editors and split-screen apps that you can use to edit Markdown. These tools show you a preview of the HTML version of whatever Markdown you're typing. If you want to try Markdown online, you should check out tools like StackEdit and Hashify, which provide formatting toolbars to help you get used to the syntax. Many text editors like Atom and Sublime, besides being awesome in their own right, have modules to support Markdown and can also do a preview. There are also dedicated Markdown editors. Ghostwriter and IA Writer are two good examples that apply a bit of formatting to the Markdown source as you type it, so that you can kind of see what you're doing, and also give you an optional preview pane. If you're going to use Markdown heavily, it's worth considering a dedicated editor. One editor in particular deserves special attention. Typora is a Markdown editor that uses GitHub-flavored Markdown, available for Mac, Windows, and Linux. It lets you choose a source code view or a completely WYSIWYG experience, is very configurable, and handles tables really nicely. Pandoc is a command line tool that converts kind of from everything to everything. Their homepage lists all the formats. This is the homepage you're seeing, plus an unofficial logo I found. Pandoc plugs into some editors and other tools you might use, like Ghostwriter and Typora, to enable those applications to save your Markdown as Word, PDF, HTML, or whatever. Pandoc understands Common Mark and GFM and can convert to ASCII doc and to and from restructured text, as well as formats like DocBook and LaTeX, and more. Okay, with your favorite editor and Pandoc, what cool stuff can we do? Let's get into some serious bicycle tricks. This is the one you're probably here for. Is it possible to use a simple tool like Markdown to manage a sophisticated suite of documentation? Maybe. Here's one approach. This approach uses a workflow called GitFlow, which is similar to the way that some engineers manage code. As a writer, although it looks complicated, it's actually not that hard. You still spend most of your time writing and editing in your favorite Markdown editor. You do need to understand a little bit about branching and code repositories. A Git client like SourceTree or GitHub Desktop makes this really easy. This way of managing documentation keeps everyone in sync, provides robust version control, makes it easy to roll back changes if needed, and keeps the docs organized so you can publish them from whichever tool you choose. Like what tools? Well, if you're already managing your docs in a Git repo on Bitbucket or GitHub, there's a built-in wiki. The structure of the wiki is determined by the file structure of the folders full of Markdown pages, so you can quickly spin up a set of docs in Bitbucket and it's available online immediately. Hugo, MKDocs, and other site generators also use the file structure to create a site structure. So you can either start there just as easily, or you can move wiki content into one of these tools. Of course, with these tools you have an additional build step because they're generating static HTML. But there's the advantage that the tools offer themes and extensions that give you more capability and let you create more professional documentation websites. You can create your own themes to integrate with an existing website, and because it's static HTML, you can put it wherever you want. And with Pandoc, you can take your Markdown source and convert the content for use in other tools, or create documents in other formats, like PDF, Word, or PowerPoint. In this way, you could collaboratively write a book in Markdown. Now I want to show you another much simpler thing you can do. Let's say you have a bunch of engineers and a bunch of non-technical people, and they need to work on the same documents, specifications, design documents, API reference, roadmaps, and so on. The engineers live and breathe ASCII text and Git repos, but don't have a lot of experience with the kinds of tools product managers, tech writers, and content designers use. How can you create a touch point where both groups can work comfortably? Are you going to teach the product managers Git flow? Are you going to teach the engineers PowerPoint? This approach is called the Git centralized workflow, and it makes Git-savvy people a little nervous because it involves no branching at all, which doesn't seem safe. But for our purposes, it's fine. The content we're working on isn't going to introduce new bugs. It's just text. As a writer, it's simpler for you. You don't have to worry about branches, so the mechanics of source control become less visible and less intrusive to you. Why no branches? Because it's not a big risk, and it makes things dead simple for the people who don't like to deal with things that are too technical. At the beginning of the day, open source tree or your favorite Git client and click pull. You don't have to think about branches. Just click pull to get the latest version of everything. Go to your editor. For non-technical contributors, I recommend Typora because it provides a WYSIWYG experience, but you can use whatever editor you like, of course. Here you can create and edit files, and the experience should be familiar to most people. Many of these editors, Typora included, provide a view of the folder you're in so you can see all the files. You can open the whole repo and see where everything is, and you can set it up so that it automatically saves when you switch files. From time to time in source tree, push the commit button and type a message about what you did. At the end of the day, or when you're ready for other people to see your work, click the push button. That's it. And of course you can use all the aforementioned tools to build the content into a wiki, a book, a Word document, a website, or whatever you like. Let's go even simpler. What if you need to take down notes fast? To write what an SME is saying, for example, but your IT department doesn't want you to use Evernote. I had this exact problem at a previous job. It turns out there is a free open source note-taking and to-do application called Joplin, which uses Markdown. It uses your Dropbox, OneDrive, or other cloud account to sync the notes across devices for you. If you don't need to sync to the cloud, you can also just store the notes on your local file system. You can even encrypt the notes for privacy. It's organized somewhat like Evernote, so you can create notebooks full of searchable notes. You can import your existing Evernote notes into Joplin too, and you can also import Markdown files. So that's pretty cool. But some Markdown editors, such as Typora, Ghostwriter, and Atom, also let you organize Markdown documents into folders that look a lot like notebooks. I discovered I could get a lot of the Joplin goodness using Typora and Dropbox, so that's what I use for note-taking. You've heard me say the word PowerPoint a couple of times. Pandoc can convert Markdown into several different slide formats, including PowerPoint. It's crazy, but it's true. Here's how to make slides from Markdown. At the top, you see Pandoc's metadata format. It uses these lines to tell PowerPoint the title, author, and date. Slides are separated by 3 hyphens, which many of you will recognize as one way to specify a horizontal rule in Markdown. There are different slide formats, DZ slides, PowerPoint, and so on, that require slightly different formatting and provide slightly different results. For PowerPoint, use a level 1 heading for a section title slide. For most of your other slides, you won't need headings. Unlike stock Markdown, Pandoc lets you specify image width and height. So here's what you get. This is a screenshot of a PowerPoint presentation I did with Markdown and Pandoc. Pandoc lets you do things like columns and spans, which are not part of normal Markdown. It also does a nice job with tables. The table early in the presentation, which lists some of the different features in Markdown flavors, started as a Markdown table. But this is not a Pandoc commercial, so I want to mention Remark, a self-contained Markdown-based slideshow. You don't need Pandoc or PowerPoint or a build process. You just take the Remark code, which is HTML and JavaScript, and put Markdown in, and you can display the slides in a browser. It's the ultimate I didn't prepare for the meeting tool. You could just about make slides from Markdown while you're camping. If you're a programmer, you'll be pleased to know that there are libraries to make it easy to convert Markdown to HTML. Here's a Python example. That's pretty simple, as you can see. Markdown is so very simple, but it's at the core of a whole ecosystem. It's easy to learn, and once you learn it, it's hard to forget. It seems like just a simple, single thing, but it has been extended, modified, and used in ways its inventor probably didn't imagine. It's just text, so it works well with source control. A whole bunch of editors have sprung up to make it easier to work with. It's websites, it's Word, it's slideshows, it's documentation, and it's used by big companies and small ones to help their content get around to where it needs to go. Markdown is a bicycle. Thank you.